in the crowded urban square outside City Hall. A single moment of cruelty shattered the everyday hum of city life. Amid a gathering of local residents celebrating community unity, a police cruiser pulled up abruptly. Out stepped Officer Ronald Jenkins, a man known for his rigid demeanor and hardened gaze. With a sneer of contempt, he zeroed in on Mrs. Evelyn Carter, an elderly black woman whose gentle presence and kind eyes had made her a respected figure in the neighborhood. Without a word of warning, Officer Jenkins advanced, his voice raised in a tone laced with prejudice. "You do not belong here." In a flash, his hand struck her cheek with brutal force. Shock rippled through the crowd. Evelyn's face, momentarily etched with pain and disbelief, betrayed nothing of the years of resilience that had carried her through hardships. Instead, she stood quietly, as if her very dignity were an unspoken protest against the injustice unfolding before everyone. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as onlookers scrambled to record the incident on their phones. In that charged moment, the community was left with a burning question. How could a sworn officer, who was meant to protect, commit such an unprovoked act of cruelty? The tension was so thick that even the sound of footsteps on the pavement seemed to pause. Then, amid the chaos, a phone rang, its clear, steady tone cutting through the uproar. That call, unexpectedly placed, carried a weight that no one could ignore. In that brief pause between shock and action, there was a promise of retribution, a hint that this moment would spark a chain of events unlike any other. The questions multiplied. Who was making that call, and what secret authority did they hold? This single moment, a brutal act captured on camera and amplified by the hum of social media, set the stage for an explosive revelation. The very foundations of authority, respect, and accountability were about to be challenged. Unbeknownst to Officer Jenkins, the phone call would soon expose a hidden truth, one that would not only end his career, but force the entire system to confront its own deep-seated biases. In that instant, as the crowd held its breath, the promise of dramatic reversal loomed large, a promise that would transform outrage into lasting change. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching from. Central City had long prided itself on diversity and progress. Its bustling streets, dotted with modern high-rises and historic landmarks, were home to people from every background. Outside City Hall, the public square served as a vibrant meeting place where community celebrations, protests, and civic events regularly took place. On this particular day, the square was alive with colorful banners, the murmur of friendly conversation, and the palpable spirit of unity that had made the city famous. At the center of today's unfolding drama was Mrs. Evelyn Carter, an elderly black woman in her early 70s. With silver hair neatly pulled back and a serene yet determined expression, Evelyn had earned the respect of her community over decades of quiet resilience. Known for her warm smile and her willingness to mentor younger generations, she had become a pillar of strength. Her attire was modest, a simple blouse and long skirt. Yet every wrinkle on her face told a story of survival and dignity in the face of adversity. Evelyn had always believed that true respect was earned through character, not by appearances or outdated stereotypes. In stark contrast stood Officer Ronald Jenkins, a veteran of the Central City Police Department in his late 40s. Jenkins was a man of rigid principles, his uniform always immaculate, his posture erect as if carved from stone. Over his long career, he had built a reputation for enforcing the law with an iron fist. Yet that reputation was now marred by whispers of bias and discrimination. His eyes, cold and unyielding, betrayed a worldview steeped in prejudice, and his actions often reflected a narrow interpretation of what it meant to protect and serve. The setting of the public square was a microcosm of the city's ideals. Stone benches, meticulously tended flower beds, and towering statues of local heroes all served as reminders of a community that valued justice and progress. Yet today, that harmony was disrupted by a clash between two very different visions of authority. The square, which had once been a sanctuary for community connection, was now charged with the energy of outrage and anticipation. As Evelyn calmly tried to navigate her way through the crowd after the officer's brutal act, the faces of those around her shifted from smiles to expressions of disbelief and sorrow. People stopped mid-conversation, their eyes fixed on the unfolding spectacle. The incident was not merely a personal affront to one woman. It was a stark symbol of a system that had long tolerated discrimination. What no one yet knew was that the unfolding events would force a reckoning. The public, having witnessed a blatant abuse of power, was ready to demand accountability. In the background, the murmur of concerned voices hinted at the beginning of a movement that would challenge the very foundations of authority in Central City. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose deep-seated bias and ultimately transform the community's faith in justice. In the immediate aftermath of the assault, the public square transformed from a scene of celebration into a hub of anger and disbelief. Officer Jenkins, still reeling from his own aggressive actions, stood defiantly as he attempted to justify his behavior. "I was simply enforcing the law," he insisted in a booming voice that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Yet, as bystanders began recounting what they had witnessed, his explanations quickly unraveled. Multiple eyewitnesses stated that Mrs. Carter had been peacefully interacting with neighbors, her presence harmless and dignified. A young man in the crowd recorded the incident on his phone, capturing the moment when Jenkins had struck Evelyn without provocation. The footage, once shared online, spread rapidly, igniting a firestorm of public outrage. Hashtags like #JusticeForEvelyn and #NoMorePoliceBias began trending, drawing support from every corner of the city. Inside the Internal Affairs Division of the police department, investigators began to compile evidence of Officer Jenkins's past behavior. Preliminary reports revealed that similar complaints had been lodged against him over the years, though they had been quietly dismissed. This history of unchecked aggression and bias confirmed what the community had long suspected, that Jenkins's actions were not an isolated incident, but part of a disturbing pattern. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter was gently assisted to a nearby bench by compassionate onlookers. Despite the physical pain and the sting of humiliation, she maintained an air of quiet dignity. Her unwavering calm in the face of such brutality became a symbol of resilience, inspiring those who had witnessed the event to demand justice. A local civil rights activist, who had been present that day, took to a nearby microphone and declared, "This is not just an attack on one woman. It is an attack on every member of this community who has ever been marginalized or mistreated. We must hold our authorities accountable." As the day wore on, internal tensions within the police department grew. Officers who had long been troubled by Jenkins's aggressive tactics began to speak up in hushed tones. In one breakroom conversation, a junior officer confided, "We have seen this before. It is time someone took responsibility for this behavior." These murmurs of dissent resonated through the department, fueling a growing chorus of calls for reform. The internal affairs investigation continued as security camera footage and digital logs were reviewed in detail. The evidence was damning, clearly showing that Jenkins's actions were driven by personal bias rather than any legitimate concern for public safety. Every new piece of evidence that emerged from the records further undermined his claims. His story, once proclaimed with such certainty, now appeared shaky and contrived. Public sentiment quickly turned against Officer Jenkins. Local media outlets began to report extensively on the incident, interviewing witnesses and community leaders who condemned the police officer's behavior. The story was no longer confined to the public square. It had become a rallying point for activists and ordinary citizens alike. The incident was seen as a microcosm of the larger, systemic problems that had long plagued law enforcement, a clear example of how unchecked prejudice could manifest in a brutal and dehumanizing way. By the end of the conflict build-up, the entire community was united in its demand for accountability. Every shared video, every eyewitness testimony, and every internal record pointed to the same undeniable truth. Officer Jenkins's actions were a product of deep-seated bias. The incident had sparked a public debate that now demanded a thorough investigation and sweeping changes within the police department. The stage was set for a dramatic escalation, a moment when the pressure for justice would force the entire system to confront its failings. In the days following the assault, the impact of the incident reverberated throughout Central City. Social media platforms were flooded with outrage. Videos of the assault were viewed millions of times, and the public response was swift and unrelenting. Hashtags such as hashtag Justice for Evelyn and hashtag #IndPoliceAbuse trended nationwide, uniting citizens from all walks of life in a collective demand for accountability. Within the police department, the Internal Affairs Unit, led by Lieutenant Marcus Daniels, a respected officer known for his impartiality and commitment to reform, launched a formal investigation into Officer Jenkins's conduct. Daniels convened several meetings with senior officers to review all available evidence, including digital logs, security footage, and numerous eyewitness statements. "We cannot allow personal prejudice to undermine our duty," Daniels declared in a meeting that was attended by both junior and senior staff. His measured, firm tone resonated deeply, especially among those who had long been troubled by the culture of unchecked bias. As the investigation progressed, additional evidence emerged that further discredited Officer Jenkins's version of events. Leaked internal emails revealed that Jenkins had been warned multiple times about his aggressive behavior, yet no corrective action had been taken. This information, once confined to dusty files, was now shared openly on social media, fueling the fire of public indignation. The department's leadership was suddenly under immense pressure from both within and outside, as community leaders and civil rights groups called for sweeping reforms. Outside, the community rallied together. In the public square near City Hall, hundreds of citizens gathered for a peaceful protest. They carried signs with messages like "No racism" in uniform and "Justice for our elders," and their chants echoed off the surrounding buildings. The protest was not just a reaction to the assault. It was a statement that systemic injustice would no longer be tolerated. Community leaders held impassioned speeches, urging that the police department be held accountable and that steps be taken to eradicate deep-seated bias from every level of authority. Meanwhile, inside the department, dissent grew stronger. Officers who had long remained silent began to share their own stories of witnessing similar incidents of misconduct. In a series of informal discussions, younger officers expressed their frustration with a system that had allowed such behavior to fester. "We must be the change we want to see," one officer remarked during a break, his voice tinged with determination. These sentiments slowly began to permeate the culture of the force, setting the stage for a significant shift in values. As public pressure mounted, Lieutenant Daniels organized a press conference at the police headquarters. Standing before a sea of reporters and community representatives, he outlined the findings of the internal investigation. "The evidence we have gathered is clear and unequivocal," he stated. "Officer Jenkins's actions were driven by personal bias, and we will not stand by while such behavior goes unpunished." His announcement that Officer Jenkins will be placed on administrative leave was met with thunderous applause from the crowd. His words underscored a renewed commitment to fairness and signaled that change was on the horizon. The tension was further heightened when a respected civil rights advocate, who had been monitoring the situation closely, issued a public call for reform. In a televised interview, the advocate argued, "This incident exposes the cracks in our system. It is not enough to remove one officer. We must overhaul our practices to ensure that every member of our community is treated with the dignity they deserve." The advocate's passionate plea added momentum to the movement for systemic change. Back within the department, Inspector T.O. Washington, tasked with compiling the final evidence, discovered one particularly damning piece of footage. The video clearly showed Officer Jenkins's hand moving in an unnecessarily aggressive manner toward Mrs. Carter, a moment that repeated itself in slow motion during internal briefings. When this footage was leaked to the public, it became the focal point of the entire debate. The visual evidence was irrefutable, and the public's demand for accountability reached a fever pitch. Every day that passed saw new layers of the story being uncovered. Former colleagues of Officer Jenkins began to testify that they had witnessed his biased behavior on several occasions. These testimonials, combined with the digital logs and leaked memos, painted a picture of a man who had long been allowed to operate with impunity. The pressure on the department to act was now insurmountable. By the end of this period of escalation, Central City had transformed from a place of routine law enforcement to a battleground for justice and reform. The collective voice of the community, amplified by social media, protests, and relentless internal pressure, had made it clear that the system would no longer tolerate unchecked prejudice. The rising tension had reached its zenith, and everyone involved sensed that a dramatic turning point was imminent. The stage was set for the final act, a moment when the truth would finally force a complete reversal of power and establish a new era of accountability. The decisive moment came on a cool afternoon as the Internal Affairs panel, led by Lieutenant Marcus Daniels, gathered in a formal briefing room at the police headquarters. The room was packed with senior board members, legal advisors, community representatives, and members of the media. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation as everyone awaited the final resolution of the investigation. With a calm and commanding presence, Lieutenant Daniels stepped up to the podium and began, after an exhaustive review of all the evidence, including digital logs, security footage, and numerous eyewitness testimonies. It is abundantly clear that Officer Ronald Jenkins acted solely out of personal bias. His behavior, which targeted Mrs. Evelyn Carter in a most degrading manner, is completely unacceptable and cannot be tolerated. His measured voice resonated throughout the room, leaving no doubt about the gravity of the situation. A profound silence fell over the assembly as Daniels continued. Effective immediately, Officer Jenkins is suspended from duty pending a full disciplinary review. This decision is not merely punitive. It is a clear declaration that no one, regardless of rank, is above accountability. The statement sent shockwaves through the room, and every eye was fixed on Officer Jenkins, whose once confident demeanor now crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. His face, once set in a smug scowl, now revealed shock and remorse. At that critical moment, Mrs. Evelyn Carter rose slowly from her seat. Despite the pain etched on her face and the lingering sting of humiliation, she carried herself with an air of quiet dignity. In a soft, unwavering voice, she spoke to the assembly. "I have lived my life with grace, and I refuse to let hatred define me. Today, I stand not as a victim, but as a symbol of our community's unwavering demand for justice. Let this moment remind us that every individual deserves respect, and that our voices, when united, can bring about change." Her words, simple yet profound, filled the room with hope and determination. Then, in a gesture that sealed the turning point, Inspector David Ramirez presented a comprehensive dossier of evidence, internal memos, security camera footage, and records of previous complaints that conclusively demonstrated a pattern of bias in Officer Jenkins's conduct. With each new piece of evidence laid bare, it became clear that Jenkins's actions were not an isolated incident, but a manifestation of a long-standing systemic problem. The Internal Affairs panel unanimously agreed that the evidence left no room for doubt. The decision to suspend Officer Jenkins was met with a powerful mix of relief and righteous indignation from everyone in the room. For the first time, the department's long-standing culture of silence was broken, and the message was unequivocal. Accountability would be enforced, and prejudice would no longer be tolerated. As the announcement echoed through the briefing room, the weight of the moment was felt by all. The turning point had shifted the power dynamic irreversibly, sending a resounding message that the era of unchecked bias was coming to an end. The public, the media, and the internal ranks of the police department alike knew that this decision marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by transparency, accountability, and the unwavering belief that justice must prevail. In the weeks following the dramatic verdict, Central City began a slow but unmistakable process of healing. News of Officer Jenkins's suspension and the sweeping disciplinary review led by Lieutenant Daniels spread throughout the city, igniting discussions about police reform and the urgent need for accountability. Social media buzzed with messages of support for Mrs. Carter and calls for systemic change, and local media hailed the decision as a turning point in the fight against bias in law enforcement. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, though still bearing the marks of that painful day, emerged as a symbol of strength and resilience. She organized community forums and spoke at local events, sharing her experience and urging citizens to stand up against discrimination. Her dignified testimony, delivered with quiet determination, resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. For many, her courage in the face of injustice became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can prevail. Leonard Brooks, a respected community leader and father of a young boy who had witnessed the incident, also became an outspoken advocate for reform. In interviews with local news outlets and at public meetings, he stressed that true leadership was measured by one's ability to treat every individual with dignity. His thoughtful, measured words further galvanized the community, and he worked tirelessly alongside civil rights groups to push for lasting change. Lieutenant Marcus Daniels, whose decisive action had been a turning point in the investigation, wasted no time in implementing reforms within the police department. Over the following weeks, the department introduced new training programs on cultural sensitivity, ethical conduct, and the importance of unbiased policing. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened to ensure that any future instances of misconduct would be addressed swiftly and transparently. Daniels' leadership reassured the community that change was not only possible, but already underway. The internal investigation into Officer Jenkins's conduct became a rallying point for discussions about systemic reform. His case was widely covered by local media and discussed at community meetings, serving as a stark reminder that no one was above accountability. While his future on the force remained uncertain, his suspension sent a clear message: prejudice in any form would no longer be tolerated. The community rallied behind the promise of reform. Town hall meetings and public forums brought together citizens, police officials, and civil rights advocates to discuss the path forward. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for All" and "Equality in Service" were displayed in busy public spaces, and local leaders pledged to continue pushing for transparency and accountability in law enforcement. One final public gathering was held in the plaza outside City Hall, where Lieutenant Daniels addressed a diverse crowd under the glow of evening lights. Today, we have taken a definitive step toward a future where fairness and justice are not just ideals, but realities, he declared. Let us remain united in our demand for accountability and continue to work together to build a community where every voice is heard. His words were met with a resounding round of applause, and the crowd's faces reflected both relief and hope for lasting change. As the city slowly returned to its routine, the legacy of that fateful day endured. Central City, once marred by an act of unchecked aggression, now stood as a symbol of resilience and reform. A community determined to ensure that every individual, regardless of background, was treated with the respect they deserved. The painful lessons of that day had sparked a movement, one that would serve as a lasting reminder that when injustice is confronted with unwavering resolve, true accountability can prevail.